The guys in The Sopranos talk about rules constantly. Rules about who can be touched, who gets made, money, wives, bosses, family, respect, murder, and even what somebody's allowed to wear at a barbecue. What's strange is that all of these get talked about with the exact same seriousness, even though they come from completely different places. Some of them are genuine rules that show up in federal cases and recorded induction ceremonies. Others are just traditions that change depending on the family and the period. And then you've got rules like Christopher paying for everybody's dinner, where Tony talks about it like Moses brought it down from the mountain, even though I couldn't find anything in actual Mafia cases saying the newest guy has to spend $1,000 every time Paulie wants lobster. The Sopranos is surprisingly accurate about a lot of this stuff. The oath Christopher and Eugene take is very close to real recorded Mafia inductions. The hierarchy is real. Kicking money upstairs is real. Made men having protections is real. Even the requirement that soldiers keep their bosses informed has a real Mafia name. Federal prosecutors have described it as having to touch base. And The Sopranos gives us an organization where almost everybody finds a reason to break one of these rules eventually. Whether it's money, actual family, somebody's feelings getting hurt, or Christopher just being sick of buying dinner. So I wanted to go through the rules myself, including the stupid ones, and see how closely these guys actually follow the code they spend the entire show talking about. A Don doesn't wear shorts. We might as well start with the smallest one. Carmine hears through Johnny Sack that Tony wore shorts at a cookout and gives him the famous correction. A Don doesn't wear shorts. Tony doesn't even know what to say.
Don doesn't wear shorts.
There's no federal Mafia rule requiring a boss to keep his knees covered. This is much closer to old school etiquette, though the story behind the line gives it some credibility. The criticism was reportedly added after James Gandolfini was contacted by somebody claiming to have real Mafia knowledge who told him the show was accurate except for one thing. A real boss wouldn't dress like Tony does. So after careful consideration, Tony did not officially break any Mafia rule by dressing like a suburban dad at his own barbecue. A Mafia boss is allowed to wear shorts, but it just does not look good in the eyes of the people. We're starting gently. It gets worse. The low man pays for dinner. Christopher's promotion into the Mafia comes with a benefit nobody bothered mentioning during the ceremony. He gets to buy everybody else's food. When Christopher complains about the enormous restaurant tabs Paulie keeps sticking him with, Tony basically tells him this is how seniority works. Tony had to do it when he was younger, Christopher has to do it now, and eventually some other poor bastard will be buying Christopher's dinners. The show treats it as established mob tradition. I went looking for the real Mafia version of this because it sounds believable. I couldn't find one. Actual Mafia cases go into ridiculous detail about obligations between ranks. There's just no rule anywhere in it about the newest guy owing everybody dinner. So this looks much more like social seniority inside their particular world. Christopher eventually decides he's had enough of the tradition. That should be a minor disagreement.
Fuck you!
Instead, Paulie and Christopher fight over the bill, leave angry, get confronted by the waiter about the tip, and somehow a dispute over who pays for dinner ends with Christopher throwing a brick at the man's head and Paulie shooting him. The waiter low-key deserved it, to be honest. The wife of a maid guy doesn't hostess. Christopher gets made and almost immediately discovers another rule. Adriana has to stop working as a hostess at Vesuvio. Christopher tells her that the wife of a maid guy doesn't hostess, even though at this point she's technically still his girlfriend. I went looking for a real Mafia rule behind that and couldn't find one. The actual Mafia cares about secrecy, loyalty, earning ability, and hierarchy. Adriana handing out menus never comes up anywhere. So this isn't Christopher breaking a rule, it's Christopher inventing one. This isn't really about status, I think it's about Christopher specifically. He's one of the most insecure guys in this entire show, always needing to be taken seriously as a real made man, always feeling like nobody respects him the way he wants to be respected. Adriana, standing in public seating strangers, is an exposure problem. If people see his girlfriend in a visibly subordinate job, that reflects on him. And reflecting badly on him is the one thing Christopher can't stand. And I love that this happens right when Christopher is struggling to meet his own financial obligations. He has trouble kicking enough money up to Paulie, gets threatened over the sportsbook, commits another robbery to cover what he owes, and still finds time to announce that Adriana's job is beneath his new position. You don't kill a boss without commission approval. This is probably the largest genuine Mafia rule violation the show ever gets close to carrying out. The commission existed partly to mediate conflicts between families, and killing a sinning family boss without approval was considered extraordinarily serious. John Gotti's murder of Gambino boss Paul Castellano is the famous real example. Federal court findings describe Castellano's murder as a breach of a cardinal Mafia rule because the commission had never approved it. Vincent and other bosses later plotted to kill Gotti in retaliation for the unauthorized assassination. The Sopranos deliberately invokes that history when Johnny Sack approaches Tony about Carmine. Johnny wants his own boss dead. Tony eventually agrees to help. Christopher arranges outside shooters so the killing can be disguised. This rule is completely real, and the two of them get close enough to count as breaking it, even though the murder itself never actually happens. They're preparing to assassinate the head of a New York family because Johnny wants to take over and Tony wants a better business arrangement. Tony eventually backs out after Carmine compromises on the money, and the hired killers have to be eliminated because they know too much. And that last detail tells you how insane this plan really was. Two senior mobsters are willing to violate one of the biggest rules in American mafia politics. The only thing that stops them is Carmine offering Tony a better percentage. The mafia doesn't deal drugs. This is one of the most famous mafia rules that becomes less clear the moment you look at actual mafia history. Some American families and individual bosses really did prohibit narcotics trafficking. They worried that drug sentences were so severe that arrested members would become informants. Other mafia families traffic narcotics anyway, and modern cases openly describe real mafia organizations making money through drug distribution. The Sopranos handles that contradiction pretty accurately. Tony catches Richie and Junior using garbage routes to distribute cocaine, and his objection is very specific. He tells Richie that if Richie and Junior want to deal drugs, that's their business. Using the garbage routes makes it Tony's business, because federal drug attention could destroy something much more valuable. So Richie isn't violating some universal mafia prohibition on cocaine. He's risking Tony's legitimate-looking garbage operation after being ordered to stop, and Richie keeps doing it. The supposed no drugs rule turns out to work exactly like a lot of mafia rules did historically. It becomes strict when the boss decides the risk is too high, while the money remains perfectly acceptable under different circumstances. Don't put your hands on a made man. Joe Pistone describes striking another wise guy as a serious violation of mafia etiquette, and The Sopranos says the same thing directly several times. Maid membership is supposed to come with protection. Bobby manages to take that rule somewhere even Tony probably wasn't expecting. He punches the boss. The fight starts after Tony repeatedly insults Janice during the Monopoly game. Bobby finally gets up and hits him, and the two of them beat the hell out of each other looking like two grizzly bears fighting. Surprisingly, Bobby wins. The family connection almost certainly helps save him. Bobby is Tony's brother-in-law. They're away with their wives. Tony has spent the evening provoking him, and turning around and sanctioning Bobby afterward would create its own embarrassment. Tony still needs to restore the hierarchy somehow. The next day, Bobby receives an assignment he's never had before. He has to kill somebody. Tony gets to remind Bobby, who gives the orders without ever saying that the murder is punishment for winning the fight. That might be one of Tony's more creative ways of enforcing a rule after it's already been broken. Killing a made man requires approval. Putting your hands on a made guy is dangerous. Killing one without authorization is much worse. The entire point of making somebody is that his life becomes politically valuable. Killing him can affect crews, earnings, and relationships between families, so leadership controls who's allowed to do it. Silvio and Carlo know this. Fat Dom still manages to talk himself into a grave. He comes into Territorial's after Vito's murder and keeps making jokes about Vito and Carlo. Silvio hits him, Carlo grabs a knife, and within seconds, a New York-made man is dead on the floor of Tony's pork store. Nobody authorized it, nobody planned it. Tony walks in afterward and immediately understands the scale of the problem. Silvio and Carlo have taken an insult and created another potential conflict with New York. This is exactly why Sanction exists. Fat Dom can be an unbearable asshole. He can insult them in their own hangout. He's still a made member of another family. Killing him changes the situation for everybody above them. A boss doesn't cry in public. Johnny Sack breaks another rule without committing a crime at all. At his daughter's wedding, the federal marshals arrive to take him away. Johnny hugs his family and cries as he leaves. Phil sees it. Later, he announces that his estimation of Johnny as a man has plummeted.
My estimation of John Sacramone as a man just fucking plummeted.
There's no real evidence of an actual mafia rule against a boss crying at his daughter's wedding.
Well, even Cinderella didn't cry.
This is masculinity and status culture being treated like law, and Johnny breaks it completely, right in front of the one audience whose opinion he can't afford to lose. And Tony, interestingly enough, is more forgiving than Phil. Tony understands why Johnny cried because he just survived death. Phil sees the boss of a family showing emotion in front of everybody and thinks the office itself has been diminished. That tells you how these social rules work. Nobody gets formally punished for breaking them. Their standing changes because the men around them decide they've seen something they weren't supposed to see. Johnny can order murders and extort people for a living. Crying when he gets dragged away from his daughter is where Phil starts questioning whether he's a man. Men don't go down on women, Junior manages to break an even stranger one. In Boca, everybody finds out that Junior performs oral sex on his girlfriend. Junior is terrified by the gossip. He explains the logic himself. Among these guys, going down on a woman is somehow associated with weakness and homosexuality. Junior even complains that he doesn't make the rules. Now obviously there is no evidence of this ever being a real Mafia rule. It's their own masculinity code. And the funniest part is that Junior isn't ashamed of enjoying it until other men know about it.
Wonderful. I don't go down enough.
The act itself has caused him no problem. His girlfriend loves him. He's happy. Then Tony starts making jokes, and suddenly Junior behaves as though classified government information has leaked. The Mafia code can apparently survive murder, extortion, and adultery. Junior Soprano eating pussy is where the institution starts getting nervous. Don't shit where you eat. Benny Fazio gets his own rule directly from Tony. Benny starts running a credit card scam through Vesuvio. Customers' numbers are being stolen from the restaurant, which means Artie's legitimate business is now taking the risk for one of Benny's rackets. Tony's reaction is simple.
You don't shit where you eat, and you really don't shit where I eat.
I know.
That is an ancient Mafia law. It's operational common sense wrapped around one of Tony's personal boundaries, and Benny breaks it without even clocking what he stepped in. Vesuvio belongs to his best friend. Tony eats there, his family eats there, the mob eats there, and it's useful partly because it looks like an ordinary legitimate restaurant. Benny turns it into a crime scene because he sees an easy source of credit cards. Tony understands something Benny doesn't. A profitable score can still be stupid if it destroys something more valuable around it. And Benny gets an extra lesson because his victim is Artie Bucco, possibly the only civilian in New Jersey who can beat up one of Tony's guys and live to complain about the aftermath. Don't disrespect the Bing. Ralph breaks a rule that tells us a lot about how Tony's morality works. After Ralph murders Tracy behind the Bing, Tony attacks him. Later, when Ralph's position in the family comes up, Tony specifically talks about Ralph disrespecting the Bing. Think about that for a second. A young woman has been beaten to death. Tony is genuinely disturbed by her death, and the show gives us plenty of reason to believe Tracy herself matters to him emotionally. But when Tony has to translate the incident into language these guys understand, one of the offenses becomes the location. Ralph did it at Tony's club. The Bing is Tony's place of business, and Ralph brought uncontrolled violence there, created a body behind the building, and forced everybody else to deal with it. So alongside the human horror of Tracy's death, the Mafia version of the problem becomes territorial disrespect. There's no actual Mafia rule saying don't murder strippers behind the boss's strip club. This is Tony inventing one on the spot, and Ralph breaks it just by doing what he already did. The fact that Tony needs a rule like that says plenty by itself. Otherwise, guys, women's are off limits. This one actually has real-world support. Joe Pistone, who spent years undercover with the Banana family as Donnie Brasco, described Mafia etiquette that included staying away from another wise guy's wife, girlfriend, daughter, or other female relative. He also listed putting your hands on another wise guy among behavior dangerous enough to get somebody killed. Then we have Paulie. Paulie goes through Christopher and Adriana's apartment while Christopher is away and sniffs Adriana's underwear. Christopher is furious when he finds out. Tony settles the dispute with one of the funniest technical interpretations of a Mafia rule in the show. He basically tells Paulie that once Christopher and Adriana are married, anything sexual involving her is off limits, which is hilarious because the real etiquette Pistone describes is broader than Tony's ruling. Girlfriends are included too. Tony somehow found a loophole that makes Paulie sniffing another made guy's fiance's underwear less serious because Christopher hasn't finished the paperwork yet. And let's not talk about Janice, who is the sister of a mob boss getting ran through by half the Mafia guys. This is exactly how the code works in The Sopranos. Everybody believes in the principle until enforcing it would create a problem they don't feel like dealing with. Then suddenly they're lawyers. A made man can't be gay. Vito's story looks extreme until you compare it with actual New Jersey Mafia history. The homosexuality taboo was very real in some Mafia circles, with potentially lethal consequences. DeCavalcante acting boss John D'Amato was murdered after allegations emerged that he had sexual relationships with men. Former soldier Anthony Capo later testified about the fear that other mobsters would refuse to respect a family led by a gay boss. That makes the Vito storyline much less exaggerated than it might seem. This one's real, and Vito doesn't even get a choice about breaking it. Getting exposed is enough. Once Vito is exposed, several Jersey guys immediately treat his continued membership as impossible. Tony hesitates. And Tony's hesitation tells us more about Mafia rules than Phil's outrage does. Vito makes a lot of money. Tony keeps trying to find some version of the situation where Vito can survive, stay away from the social club, and continue earning. Phil treats the taboo as absolute. Tony keeps calculating the price. The rule supposedly deals with honor and masculinity, and within about 5 minutes, Tony's turned it into an accounting problem. That's basically the entire Mafia code in miniature. You have to make your bones. Bobby gives us another famous Mafia standard that wasn't universal. In some families and periods, participating in a murder was expected before full induction. Joe Pistone's own path toward being made involved being assigned a murder, and making your bones became closely associated with proving that somebody was willing to kill for the organization. Other families and periods use different standards, so I wouldn't call prior murder a universal requirement for every American-made man. Bobby somehow rises pretty far without ever killing anybody. He's already a made man, married to the boss's sister, and moving closer to Tony's inner circle. Tony discovers Bobby has never killed anyone. Bobby's father was a legendary hitman, and Bobby himself came close a few times, but his father kept him away from that part of the life. Tony eventually changes that. After Bobby beats him in the Monopoly fight, Tony gives him the Montreal murder. So Bobby doesn't prove himself before becoming made. He gets his first killing years afterward, partly because his boss is still angry that Bobby beat him up on vacation. There is no retiring from this. Eugene thinks $2 million might buy his way out. Tony reminds him that he took an oath and that there's no retiring from this. That principle has real roots. Mafia membership is traditionally understood as lifelong, and the initiation itself is built around the idea that the member leaves only through death. But Eugene brings up a real historical problem with Tony's absolute version of the rule, Joe Bonanno. Bonanno eventually left New York and lived in Arizona after losing power, and Eugene specifically brings him up when Tony insists nobody retires. The example doesn't help Eugene, and that's probably the more accurate version of the rule anyway. A made guy can't simply decide he's finished because he inherited enough money, but retirement has existed under exceptional circumstances, especially around age, health, political settlements, or men who had already lost active power. Eugene is still useful. He's young enough to earn and kill. Tony has no reason to release him. So, there's no retiring becomes another rule whose flexibility depends heavily on who's asking. The ceremony has to be done right. Phil's final rant about Jersey gives us one of the funniest cases where a character complains about a rule that the show itself proves Jersey actually follows. Phil says Jersey makes anybody and everybody. He complains about their induction ceremony and claims they don't even prick the new member's finger. We watch Christopher and Eugene get made. Their fingers are pricked. The blood is placed on Saint cards. The cards are burned while they take the oath. So Phil is simply wrong about that part, and somehow his complaint still has a bizarre real-world parallel. Testimony about the real DeCavalcante family described John Gotti forcing New Jersey members to redo induction ceremonies because New York considered the original ceremonies improper. Phil's accusation therefore captures a very real type of New York snobbery toward New Jersey, while getting the factual detail wrong inside the show. That fits Phil pretty well. There may be a real grievance buried inside the rant. He's still ranting. Obey the boss. Now we get into the rules that federal prosecutors actually describe as core organizational requirements. The real mafia hierarchy is straightforward on paper. Soldiers answer to captains, and captains answer to the administration. Disloyalty to the recognized hierarchy, breaking the chain of command, or disobeying orders can bring serious punishment. Silvio knows this better than almost anybody, which makes his decision during the Esplanade conflict so interesting. Tony orders the guys to stop stealing from the construction site. Silvio quietly gives Patsy permission to take expensive floor tiles anyway. He's irritated over Tony pushing Christopher higher and uses the theft to make a point. Silvio eventually tells Tony what he did, and Tony understands exactly why. This isn't some reckless associate misunderstanding the rules. It's the consigliere deliberately ignoring a boss's order to communicate dissatisfaction with the boss. The mafia hierarchy survives partly because everybody agrees orders travel downward. Silvio finds a way to protest Tony's leadership by breaking that exact rule while remaining one of Tony's most loyal men. You have to touch base. This may be the most useful real mafia rule that The Sopranos never gives a catchy name. Prosecutors describing the real Philadelphia crime family say members have to touch base with higher-ups about criminal activity. Soldiers keep captains informed, captains keep the administration informed, and people conducting serious crimes on the side without approval can face severe discipline. Tony B is basically a case study in why that rule exists. Tony Soprano is deliberately trying to keep Jersey out of the Lupertazzi conflict. Tony B takes the Joey Peeps job anyway. He's having money problems, he sees an opportunity, and he acts without Tony's approval. That one private decision creates consequences far beyond the murder itself. Johnny Sack suspects Jersey involvement. Tony lies to protect his cousin. The relationship between Tony and New York gets worse. Tony B later becomes personally invested in the conflict after Angelo is killed. One guy going into business for himself eventually helps drag an entire family toward a confrontation it was actively trying to avoid. The real touch-based rule sounds like boring administration. Tony B shows why mobsters invented it. You have to kick up. This rule is completely real. Federal cases describe criminal proceeds moving upward through the hierarchy. Soldiers and associates kick a percentage to higher-ranking people, and that money eventually supports the administration. One real case describes it almost like a tax criminals pay for the protection and legitimacy of operating under the Mafia name. Paulie and Vito understand the rule perfectly. They just don't like it when Tony might die. While Tony is in a coma, Paulie and Vito have made a fortune from the Colombian score and owe Tony his share. Silvio tells them the money goes to Carmela while Tony is incapacitated. Suddenly, both of them become very interested in Tony's medical prognosis. They delay handing over the money because if Tony dies, they might be giving away a huge amount of cash for no reason. Once Tony's recovery starts looking more likely, the envelopes appear. I love this example because nobody needs the rule explained. They know exactly what they owe. They're calculating whether the person entitled to collect it will still be alive long enough to complain. The sacred hierarchy lasts right up until Paulie thinks he might save himself $100 grand. Keep your problems inside the family. A real Mafia induction recorded by the FBI included instructions about how a soldier should handle disputes with his captain. The soldier was supposed to bring the issue upward through the organization rather than creating his own outside solution. Christopher and Eugene receive a similar instruction when they're made. Disputes stay within the family. Paulie spends a good part of Season 4 doing the opposite. He feels overlooked by Tony. He resents Ralph's earning power. He thinks his years in the life deserve more appreciation. So he develops a private relationship with Johnny Sack, the underboss of another family, and starts discussing things that belong inside Jersey. Johnny encourages him because the arrangement is useful. Paulie thinks he's building a connection with New York. Tony eventually realizes information is leaking badly enough that he begins keeping Paulie away from sensitive business. This goes beyond Paulie being a gossip. The whole point of the internal dispute structure is to stop a disgruntled soldier from creating alliances outside his own hierarchy. Paulie manages to do exactly that because somebody told him Carmine thinks highly of him. The boss should stay away from the street work. This one is more organizational principle than sacred oath, although it's very real. The real Mafia hierarchy is built so the underboss helps insulate the boss from direct criminal involvement, while captains act as intermediaries between the administration and the soldiers doing day-to-day work. Tony has never been particularly good at being insulated. The most extreme late example is Christopher. Christopher is injured after the car crash. Tony looks at him, sees the damaged baby seat in the back, and makes a decision. He kills Christopher himself. By this point, Tony has captains, soldiers, and people who would kill Christopher if Tony ordered it. There's no operational reason the boss of North Jersey personally needs to suffocate his own capo on the side of the road. Tony does it because the decision happens inside his own head in that moment. That's one of the biggest differences between Tony and bosses like Carmine. Carmine uses hierarchy to put distance between himself and the violence. Tony keeps collapsing that distance whenever the violence becomes personal. The organization is supposed to protect the boss from the street. Tony keeps walking back into the street himself. This family comes before your real family. Christopher and Eugene's oath is extremely serious about this. Real induction ceremonies have a made member swearing allegiance to the organization above every other obligation, including his own blood family. One indictment states it directly. Tony administers that kind of oath. Then Coco talks to Meadow. The moment Tony learns what happened, every political calculation disappears. He finds Coco in a restaurant and nearly kills him. Coco is a made New York member. Relations with Phil are already terrible. Tony understands perfectly well that attacking him could make the situation worse. Meadow is his daughter. That decides it. And I can't really imagine Tony doing anything else. That's exactly why this rule is so interesting. These men swear that the criminal family comes before their actual family, while some of their strongest emotions in the entire series come from wives, children, brothers, cousins, and parents. The oath asks them to create an artificial family more important than the real one. Tony can administer that oath with a straight face. Put Meadow in front of it and the whole thing disappears. Respect another man's wife. Ralph's joke about Ginny Sack gives us another real rule. One Ralph breaks the moment the joke leaves his mouth, though whether it actually costs him anything turns out to be a separate question entirely. Ralph makes a disgusting joke about Johnny's wife in a room full of Jersey guys. Johnny eventually hears about it and wants Ralph dead. Carmine agrees that the insult deserves consequences, but refuses to authorize murder because Ralph is making too much money for the Esplanade. That's the whole honor code in one dispute. Johnny thinks his wife's dignity should be priceless. Carmine puts a price on it, and the men debating the sanctity of another man's wife are surrounded by guys who cheat on their own wives constantly. Nobody notices the contradiction because the rule isn't really about treating women well, it's about another man's status. Ginny matters because insulting Ginny insults Johnny. Carmela's dignity when Tony cheats on her has no similar institutional protection, because Tony is the person creating the humiliation. The rule protects male honor much more reliably than it protects any woman. Keep Mafia business away from outsiders. Omerta is broader than refusing to become an informant. Made members are also supposed to keep the organization's business away from outsiders. Christopher becomes incredibly careless with that boundary near the end of his life. After getting drunk at the Bing and feeling humiliated by Tony and Paulie, he goes to JT Dolan's apartment. JT understands immediately that he's hearing things he doesn't want to hear. Their relationship has already blurred the line between Christopher's legitimate Hollywood fantasy and his mafia life, and now Christopher is unloading the kind of information that can get an outsider killed. JT finally reminds him that he's in the mafia.
Chris, you're in the mafia.
The murder is horrifying, and it also solves a problem Christopher has created for himself. He's talked too much to somebody outside the family. The secrecy rule is supposed to stop that situation before it exists. Christopher breaks it and deals with the consequences by creating another body. Never admit this thing exists. Johnny Sack breaks one of the simplest versions of omerta from a courtroom. His plea agreement requires an allocution. Johnny formally acknowledges the mafia. Phil is disgusted. You don't ever admit the existence of this thing. Ever. This is a real mafia principle. Actual induction evidence includes vows not to reveal the organization's activities and even to avoid acknowledging its existence to outsiders. Johnny knows exactly what he's doing. He's facing a massive sentence and trying to protect some of what remains for Ginny and the family. So he takes the deal. And again, the rule becomes negotiable once the consequences get personal enough. Phil can sit outside prison and talk about honor because Phil isn't the one making Johnny's decision. Johnny chooses his wife, his assets, and whatever future he still has over the code. The men who haven't been offered his deal get to call him weak afterward. Never cooperate with law enforcement. And now we get to the rule these guys talk about more seriously than almost anything else. Do not become a rat. This is genuine mafia law. Real induction criteria emphasized being a stand-up guy who would refuse to cooperate with law enforcement, and omerta specifically prohibits members from giving information to authorities. Informants could be marked for death. The Sopranos family is absolutely full of them. Big Pussy becomes one of the FBI's most valuable sources while remaining one of Tony's oldest friends. Ray may be even worse from the organization's perspective because nobody seriously suspects him. He remains a captain, attends meetings, complains about expenses to the FBI, and feeds them information, while everyone around him treats him like a respectable old-timer. By the final season, Carlo also flips. New York has the same problem. Jimmy cooperation helps destroy Johnny Sack. The ultimate mafia rule is being broken on both sides, and that's one reason the constant speeches about loyalty become harder to take seriously as the show goes on. The FBI isn't defeating this organization by finding outsiders willing to testify about them. The organization keeps producing its own witnesses. The rules that only get worse if we use. There's one last category worth separating from everything above. In 2007, Italian police found a written conduct code in the hideout of Sicilian boss Salvatore Lo Piccolo. The press called it the Mafia's 10 Commandments. These are Sicilian Cosa Nostra rules, and they shouldn't automatically be treated as rules binding Tony's American family. But if we apply a few of them to the Sopranos just for fun, Tony's crew somehow looks even worse. Remember, the Sicilian code says one member shouldn't simply introduce himself directly to another. A third person is supposed to make the introduction, which immediately makes Paulie walking across a wedding reception toward Carmine much funnier. Paulie sees Carmine and approaches him himself. He gives Carmine his name, and he starts trying to discuss Tony and the situation between the families, because Johnny Sack has convinced Paulie that Carmine already thinks highly of him. Again, I'm not saying Paulie's broken some real American mafia rule here. We're applying a Sicilian code found years later. But under that code, Paulie's humiliating conversation has started badly before Carmine even asks who he is. Never be seen with cops. The Sicilian code also says members shouldn't be seen with police. Tony develops a strange little relationship with Agent Harris. Harris spends years investigating him. Later, as terrorism becomes Harris's focus, the relationship becomes almost friendly. Tony feeds Harris information about possible terrorism connections, and Harris eventually gives Tony information useful in locating Phil. By the end of the show, the boss of North Jersey has a federal agent helping him survive a mafia war. From Tony's perspective, it's practical. From an old Sicilian rulebook, The entire relationship is insane. Don't go to pubs and clubs. Another commandment says Mafia members shouldn't frequent pubs and clubs. The headquarters of Tony Soprano's organization is a strip club. I don't think this one needs much analysis. Half of the Sopranos has just been disqualified. The Sicilian list also tells members to respect their wives. Tony could probably produce a 6-season compilation violating this one. He maintains mistresses throughout his marriage, sleeps with women Carmela knows nothing about, brings the consequences of those affairs into their home, and eventually has one former mistress call Carmela directly and tell her about another affair Tony had with Svetlana. And Tony still expects Carmela to behave like the wife of a boss. That last Sicilian rule brings us back to where most of these rules end up in The Sopranos. The guys love rules because rules give them status. Being maid means somebody owes you respect. Being boss means somebody owes you obedience. Being senior means Christopher buys dinner. Being another man's wife means people are supposed to watch what they say about you. The code becomes much less attractive whenever the obligation points in the other direction. Tony wants Ralph to respect the protection that comes with Tony being boss, and Tony struggles to respect the protection Ralph gets from being maid. Paulie expects money and respect from Christopher while quietly complaining about Tony to New York. Johnny Sack demands that everyone treat Ginny's honor as sacred and breaks one of the biggest rules himself when prison puts enough pressure on him. Silvio is the consigliere and deliberately ignores Tony's order at the Esplanade. Vito's sexuality supposedly makes the rules absolute until Tony starts thinking about how much money Vito earns. Christopher takes an oath of secrecy and eventually unloads his mafia problems onto a screenwriter. Even Carmine, probably the guy who understands the institutional side of the mafia better than anyone else in the show, is willing to discuss murdering his own underboss when Johnny becomes bad for business. That's why the mafia code in The Sopranos never feels completely fake. A lot of the rules are real. The hypocrisy is real too. Real American mafia history is full of bosses who banned things their own families did, members who swore omerta and became witnesses, people who murdered bosses without permission, and organizations that changed their standards whenever power changed hands. The Sopranos takes that contradiction and puts it into almost every relationship. These guys really do have rules. They just keep discovering exceptions whenever following one becomes more expensive than breaking